Chapter 5 Malini. Priya, of course I sought out grand tales. I do not like my own ignorance, and those tales were the ones that made you. Surely you learned them as a child. Surely they were as much the milk that shaped you as tales of the mothers were for me. Don't you realize that I want to know everything about you? That even now, when I should have forgotten, all I desire is to know your heart better than my own. Malini's army made it all the way to the edge of Sakata before the monsoon rains barred their path. No one with any sense battled when the deluge of rainfall swept across the empire and churned the soil to a sea of mud. So her army made camp and waited for the skies to clear. In the respite from battle, Malini listened to the rain beating against the walls of her tent and wrote letters to Priya that she would never send. If she were wise, she would burn her own words. If she were wiser still, she would not have written them at all. But this was her indulgence. She wrote, and preserved the letters carefully in the lining of a jewelry box, unpicking the lining at night so she could read them all over again. And surely there were worse indulgences than wanting to love someone, to be known. Sometimes I think of my army as a wave. I never placed my feet in the sea when I had the chance, but now I think of my army as the waters that carry me. And my throne is the inevitable shore. We have fought Chandra across the empire, in Dwarali, in Alor. He has no gift for keeping allies. He wants people to bow and scrape and beg for his scraps. But why would they, when I have offered them so much more? So his armies crumble, and I stride onward, and bind myself to allies with vows and deals and promises. I have so many debts, Priya. Debts to my men. Debts to you. I never forget my debt to you. Her men huddled in tents and drank wine and played games of chance by lamplight, and her women gathered with her and played their own games. One of the women from Duawali, Sahar, a broad-shouldered archer with a particularly filthy sense of humor, suggested the singing game, a mischievous light in her eyes. One bawdy song begins, then the next starts on the syllable of the last word ends with, and so on, until there is no more songs or the players are too drunk to remember them, she said, and cracked a grin at Malini's expression. Empress, what good is a game if it doesn't allow its player to speak of little filth? I like strategy games, Deepa offered faintly, looking mildly horrified. Razia poured her a particularly large glass of liquor and slid it over sympathetically. I promised you all the young lords and soldiers will be playing the same game in their own tents, Razia said, sharing a brief amused look with Sahar. And their songs are much less refined than ours shall be. As long as I am not required to join in with them, they can do as they like, Malini said dryly. But you will play with us, Razia said, raising an eyebrow. Malini could not bring herself to refuse. It was difficult to remember songs over wine, and more difficult still to find common ground between the songs from Duruali and the bawdy songs from Parijat. Lata turned out to be the best of them. When Malini woke in the morning, she found herself laughing at odd moments at the memory of Lata passionately reciting a full range of rude verses about mothers-in-law from across the empire. In the daylight hours, as the rains crept on, Malini tried to soothe her aching head and focus on writing letters that brought her very little joy, but were nonetheless necessary to achieving her goals. Experience had taught her that the most successful battles were the ones won by words. Phrases, carefully chosen, could be like a knife, threatening, promising, wounding. She had learned from Lord Narayan, one of the loyal Sakatan nobility who had accompanied her from Shumla, that the rot had spread through Sakata. The rot, he'd said carefully, is not simply an Ahirani problem, as it once was. The High Prince is a man driven by fear, Empress. Fear of the loss of his throne. Fear his people will starve. But his fears are not unfounded. So she set the blade of her words carefully to the High Prince's weakness. She wrote to him with the offer of crops from Alor and Shrumna to feed his people, the restoration of the loyalty of the low princes who had abandoned him to serve her, new trade with Dwarali, food and prosperity, and a future. I cannot betray the rightful emperor, his scribe had written in return. The only hope Sakata and my people have lies upon the righteous path, a path carved long ago, for all of us, by the mothers. I will not stray from it. Weeks passed as her messengers traveled to and fro from the High Prince's fort in pouring rain. As her pile of unsent letters to Priya grew, the language blooming wilder and stranger with honesty. I miss you, she wrote to Priya and to herself. But not as you miss me, I think. I miss you because I let myself care for you for a brief time. I let you into my heart. And I find now that I am empress, now that the world lies at my feet, my heart is a closed door. I am meant to be someone beyond mortal feeling, someone shaped by fire and prophecy into more than flesh and bone and want. What I was with you, I can never be again." To the high prince she replied, "I am the mother's chosen, prophesied by the nameless God. Following me is a choice blessed by the mothers and the nameless God alike. Trust me, and all will be well." On the day the rains cleared, Malini finally received the response she had been waiting for. He would surrender to her. He would return land to the low princes who had turned on him. He would trust in the will of the mothers, and in her. More often than not, Malini woke up exhausted. Dreams tangled in her skull, Narina's and Alori's voices fading in her ear like distant storms and winds. But today she opened her eyes long before the dawn chorus of birdsong to the unfamiliar feeling of hope blooming open in her chest. Today, if she was lucky and clever and all her politicking worked as she had intended, she would take Sakata from her brother's grasp. His last ally would finally yield into her hands. Malini met the day by bathing from a cold bucket bath. She kneeled to have her hair oiled and combed and plaited to the now familiar sound of her army awakening, the clatter of pots, the grumbling low voices of men, the crackle and spit of vats over fires as the camp cooks prepared the morning meal. As her maid Swati knotted ivory flowers into a crown at her head as she tucked the pleats of her own sari to knife sharpness. She waited for the familiar rhythmic thump of dozens of booted feet against the hard soil. When she finally heard soldiers on night duty pass her tent on their final patrol, she released a slow breath and said to her maid, "Prepare the tea and bring the map, Swati." The women began to arrive, the guard beyond Malini's tent announcing them as they entered. Razia and her attendant women, then Deepa with apologies from Lata. "She'll be here soon, Empress," she said. "She was working late into the night, preparing for your meeting with the High Prince. I saw her with the prince from Ala earlier." Thank you, Lady Deepa," Malini said before the girl could continue. There was a large table installed in her tent, large enough for the map of Parijatvipa to be unrolled in its entirety. The map was made of thick cloth, the borders of each city-state and the farmland and villages that surrounded them embroidered in weighty darts of thick silk. It was an old piece of work, one gifted to Malini by the Sultan of Duarali himself. The maize fort of Sakata, the High Prince's ancient home, was drawn in swirls like a multi-petaled flower, its thorns held within its bloom. Malini considered it and considered, too, how close her goal was. Once she had the High Prince's surrender, she would be able to turn her army toward Parijat, with no risk of an enemy army at her back. The Sakatan low princes and lords who had chosen to serve her would have their loyalty rewarded with new wealth, and with the lands they had lost to the High Prince when they had refused to accept Chandra as their emperor. Her army would have a taste of victory and Sakatan gold, and the promise of a clear and shining path toward Chandra and his army and the throne. Once the High Prince was dealt with, she could finally destroy her brother. The tent curtain rustled once more. "My lady," one of the guards said, a crescent on his helmed face, visible through the gap between curtain and tent. "Prince Rao and your sage are here." "Let them in," Malini said. Lata swept in first. Lata's hair was bound back in its usual tight knot of braids, woven into a corona around her head. But she wore a rich sari of fine silk, its dark fabric patterned with deep blue lotus flowers. She had protested when Malini had first gifted the clothing to her. "This isn't the way of sages," she'd said. But Malini had insisted. "You're a reflection of me. Consider responsibility of your new role." "I am only a sage, still," Lata had said levelly. "As my advisor, you know that isn't true," Malini had replied, and that had been the end of that. A moment after Lata, Rao entered and made a brief, courteous greeting. His turban was neat, his sash properly tied, his brace of knives glittering and well-oiled at his belt. But Malini had a strong sense that he had not slept. It was something about the way he held himself. Shoulders too tight, eyes pinched and shadowed, his head craned forward as if he couldn't manage its weight. "Drink some tea," she told him. He managed a wan smile. "And you too, Lata. I know you haven't rested." I had to consider every aspect of your intended pact with the High Prince, Empress, Lata said, even as she obediently took up a cup. I'll sleep once the work is done. A slight sidelong glance at Rao. We both will. We've bad news, Rao said, but not entirely unexpected. He took his tea, drank fast, as if he didn't even taste it. Our food supplies are decreasing fast. Malini bit back a curse. Rao was right. She had known this was a possibility. The army was vast and had to be fed, and supplies from loyal city-states arrived at best unevenly. Her men had begun taking food from Sakitan villages and fields by awful necessity, but more often than not the villages they passed were starving, the fields wrong. Do we have enough food to see us to Parijat? It was Lata who answered. It's possible, she said, but we will have to be careful, and we'll have to move on Parijat as swiftly as we can. Malini left her tent to join the morning war council with her women, arrayed around her. She wore her own saber, a gleaming scar of a blade, lightweight enough for her to carry comfortably upon her hip. Lady Razia and two of her favorite guards, Manvi and Sahar, carried heavier bows at their backs, their gait proud. Together they walked beneath tasseled parasols, held up by attentive Parijati guards, the soldiers going silent or bowing their heads as they passed. Malini had seen her father walk as she did now, many times, through the halls of the Imperial Mahal, with his sword at his side and his advisors around him, servants and soldiers alike falling to worship stillness at the sight. There was satisfaction in following his footsteps, at least in this. An emperor's power lay in the wisdom, loyalty, and clout of his closest confidants, in maintaining ties with high-born men from across the empire. A princess's power was demonstrated through her adornment, the weight and shine of her jewels, the flowers in her hair, the beauty of her attendants. As an empress's power, well, there had been no empresses before Malini, so she had carved out the rules and requirements of empresshood herself, and hoped that throwing together the authority of one role and the visage of another would be enough. The war council took place in a vast circular tent. Near her own seat stood Lord Mahesh, his expression severe. There was no sign of Rao. He had left her, as he often did, long before the war council took place, on his own business. When Malini entered the space, the men bowed. She arranged herself on the makeshift dais of gold brocade cushions that stood in place of her throne, straightened her spine, and raised her head. Before Lord Mahesh could raise his own feet and delve into the minutiae of the negotiation with Sakata's high prince that lay ahead of them, another lord stood abruptly. He was from Shrungna, but Malini was only vaguely familiar with his face, which was not young, but still relatively lineless and twisted in defiant anger. I speak for Shrungna, he announced. Malini let her gaze linger, momentarily, on the old familiar lords who sat behind him. By the uneasy but unsurprised looks on their faces, he did not speak for Shrungna. But he was not acting entirely out of turn either. Lord Prakesh, seated behind him, watched with shrewd, thoughtful eyes, waiting to see what she would do in the face of challenge to her power, no doubt. Malini said nothing. She let her gaze fix on the lord once more as he clenched and unclenched his hands, waiting for her to respond, as if he had the right to her ear. He had already erred by standing out of turn, by demanding to be heard, by showing her and her council disrespect. Let him continue to lay the wood for his own pyre, if he liked. Everything about him was clean and polished, the fabric of his tunic new and cut in the latest court style set by the king of Shrungna himself, with a narrow sash and angular darts of bright fabric at the shoulder. His skin was pale brown. She glanced at his collar and at his wrists, but no lighter strip of skin was visible. He was new, fresh to the war from Parijatvipa and full of his own self-importance. Even the highborn who zealously protected their skin had turned sun-brown at the face and hands after long enough traveling in the open. The Shrungani had sent supplies a mere half-month ago. This man must have come with them. Who knew what poison had been poured into his ear in the Shrungani court before he had come to join Malini, fresh coin and fresh soldiers at his command? It will be interesting to find out. We cannot afford to be generous to the High Prince, the Shrungani lord said, when Malini merely stared at him. If you insist on forgiving a traitor, Empress, Shrungna may insist on retreating from a foolish war. The Shrungani lord shifted anxiously. Lord Prakash was the only one who did not squirm. He watched intently, unmoving, but his brow was furrowed. This threat, then, had not been expected, by him at least. She was glad he had not condoned it, even if he had not done her the favor of silencing his fellow lord. To her left, Lord Mahesh was clearing his throat, demanding attention. "You are unfamiliar with war, I think, Lord Rohit. When I have spoken of strategy, you may express your concerns, but you should not threaten us." His tone was courteous, but there was a warning in his eyes that the Shrungani lord would have been a fool to miss. "We should not be here," the lord burst out. "A fool after all. We should be in Parijat, dragging that dog from his throne. We did not come here to sacrifice our men and our coin to squabble between the high prince and his low kin." The Sakatan princes stood abruptly, one sea of buzzing, angry movement. "The high prince is a traitor," one said sharply, "allied with that dog. We fought for the empress in Duawali, we fought in Alor, and in return he seized our lands, our ancestral villages, our taxes. But we would rather win than face unnecessary strife. You think Shrungna has a right to demand blood from Sakatan's highborn?" "Rohit," one of the Shrungani lords murmured, trying to quell him, far too late in Malini's opinion. You would be starving without Shrugna," Lord Rohit retorted. "You need food from the estates. A significant portion of my crop taken, and what has Shrugna had in return? What? We deserve— You jumped up, fool, you deserve nothing." "Enough!" Malini said. The men fell silent. Good. At least she had power enough still for that. "We cannot enter Parijat with the threat of Sakata at our backs," she said, calm and even. Let the truth speak for her. It was implacable, inescapable, and they were, nearly all of them, seasoned warriors. Let them recognize it for themselves. "We cannot leave our allies without peace on their own lands." She did not say, "We bargained for the loyalty of those little princes when we fought Chandra's forces in Dwarali," as he threw wave after wave of soldiers against the walls of Lalakila, breaking them into waves upon the rocks. She did not say, "If I break my word, my bond, our efforts to see Chandra deposed will come to nothing." This, Lord Rohit was owed no explanation from her, so instead she said, "Perhaps the Shrungani lords wish to inform this lord how he is erred." "I—" began Lord Rohit. His words died as Prakash laid a heavy hand on his shoulder, urging him back down to his seat. The Shrungani contingent were grey-faced, jaws tight with embarrassment and anger. Whatever they had hoped to achieve by sending forward Lord Rohit with his bluster and righteous rage, they had not achieved it. "Empress," Lord Prakash said. He bowed his head. "Lord Rohit meant no harm. If you will show forgiveness—" The Shrungani's lord's speech faded as Aditya entered the room. Malini's eldest brother was dressed as always, like a priest of the Nameless, in a pale blue dhoti, his long hair uncovered and tied neatly behind his back. But in place of the traditional shawl over a bare torso, he wore a tight tunic padded with fabric and panels of metal, clothing for battle. This was the only concession he had given to the world he had been unwillingly dragged back into. He would not seek to take Chandra's place upon the throne, would not be the imperial crown prince he had once been, before a vision from the nameless god had led him to a life of priesthood. But he could not simply be a priest any longer. The saber at his belt, strange against the pale warship blue of his dhoti, clinked as he bowed to Malini, then kneeled at her right. Malini kept her eyes fixed on the Shrungani, waited with stony patience until Lord Prakash remembered himself. "Our most sincere apologies." Whatever speech he'd intended to make was reduced to one phrase. He bowed again, and at an unsubtle kick to his knee, Lord Rohit scrambled to his feet and bowed also before lowering himself once more. In her position, Chandra would have had Lord Rohit's tongue torn from his throat, or arranged in a slow and brutal execution. Her brother had never taken kindly to slights to his pride. But Malini did not have the luxury of such careless cruelty, and her anger burned colder and slower than Chandra's ever had. She nodded instead, allowing it, and thought, "When this is done, and Parijatvipa is mine, I will remember you." "Lord Mahesh," Malini said, "please continue." After a moment, Mahesh began to speak and laid out the task ahead of them. As Malini approached her chariot, her army parted around her. Half her forces arrayed in their armor kept their eyes on her. She kept her gaze forward and her head high. She could not look afraid. This was not meant to be battle. It felt like one. She felt the battle in the pounding of her heart as she climbed into her chariot. In the way, senses sharpened, knife keen. She heard the creak of the metal beneath her feet, and the quiet shudder of her chariot's canopy in the wind. The clatter of hooves as her armed riders surrounded her, a sea of cavalry carrying Parijatvipan banners, painfully white under the beating sun. Lady Razia rose up onto the chariot beside her, bow in hand. Her guardswomen on horseback arranged themselves smoothly into a sickle formation around the chariot. To their right, Malini's general rose onto his own chariot. Lord Mahesh met her eyes. He gave her a grave nod. She grasped the rail of the chariot. Her charioteer had his ear turned toward her, waiting. "Signal the men," she said to Lord Mahesh. The chariot shuddered forward. The clatter of armor and hoofs filled the air as her army moved across flat, dusty terrain under a gleaming blue sky toward the High Prince's fort. It loomed before them, small at first on the horizon, then large and larger still as they drew closer to its walls. There was a greeting party awaiting them, a handful of Sakitan soldiers, no more than that. "The High Prince knew we were coming," Malini murmured to Razia. "Why has he not arranged an appropriate welcome?" The High Prince was not the first highborn ruler who had been unwilling to bow to Malini, but when they had negotiated their surrender, they had all acknowledged her with ceremony, with proper courtesy of warriors and their finest horses, courtiers, gifts. Before her was almost nothing. Unease seeped through her. "I don't know, Empress," Razia said, sounding similarly wary. She looked at her women, raised her hand in signal. One of them drew closer. "Warn the others to be watchful," Razia ordered. Malini turned toward Lord Mahesh. "The High Prince's negligence concerns me. Something is wrong," Malini said sharply, pitching her voice to carry over the churning noise of wheels and hoofs. He turned his head, meeting her gaze. "It is wise to be cautious," Mahesh said, but he did not sound the conch at his belt and call for the attention of his commanders. His chariot continued rolling forward, dust rising in clouds beneath its spoked wheels. "But the High Prince has always been a strange man. I knew him in our shared youth, and I can assure you he has never cared for pomp or ritual. He will surrender. We must simply wait." "He has not surrendered yet." If she ordered Mahesh to halt their forces, would he? Could he? She knew an army had its own momentum and could not be easily stopped in its tracks. She turned her head forward, gazing over the expanse of men before her. Beneath her, her chariot shuddered to a slow stop as they neared the edge of the city. She thought of all the High Prince's messages, the fear she had read in them, the anxiety knotted through it all. How she wished she had crossed paths with him at least once during her years in the Imperial Mahal, and taken the measure of him herself. Ink, it seemed, was not enough to weigh the heart of a man. They waited, silence growing, wind rippling through the flags of Parijatvipa that hung from chariots. The gates of the fort slowly yawned open. No army emerged, only one man. The sight was so strange that Malini's own men froze, unmoving, as the gates drew shut once more, barring them from the city. He was unmistakably a priest. Ash-marked, his expression mild, he crossed the dusty ground that lay before the gates of Sakata. As he walked, a cloud of that same golden dust rose around him, haloing him like motes of light. Malini's guards did not move. Finally, a single commander on horseback made his way forward to greet the priest. The ground was silent for one breath, then two. The commander rode back to Malini and said, "Empress, he wishes to speak with you on the High Prince's behalf." "Bring him to me," said Malini. A susurration ran through the men, sudden as a rippling breeze, as the priest was brought before her chariot. He bowed in one graceful motion, then raised his head. He was an old man, gaunt and sun-wizened, but his eyes were fierce. "You will not be allowed to enter the city, Princess Malini," the priest said, by way of greeting. His mouth was widened into a smile. "And the High Prince will not be leaving his throne to greet you here." Ah, so this was a trap. But what kind of trap? The High Prince was well defended in his city. The fort of Sakata was famed for its complexity, its multiple walls that wound and twisted, covered with watchtowers. It was said that if someone had been able to view it from the sky, its structure would resemble a blooming 100-petaled lotus. Malini had examined its likeness on her map mere hours ago. To siege the city would be nigh impossible. To starve out the people within it would cost Malini more than she could afford to give. If the High Prince had invited her into his palace, if he had surrounded her and her advisors there, then perhaps she would understand the nature of the vice she had been caught within. But this she could not comprehend. If the High Prince will not negotiate with me, I can only offer him war, Malini replied. The priest inclined his head. I am a priest, but I am also a warrior, the priest said. His eyes were flint. Emperor Chandra has not waited idly for the betrayal of his blood siblings, Princess Malini. The priesthood has grown. There are those who pray by fire and kneeling by flowers and funerary rites. And then there are men like me, who have learned a different kind of prayer. Will you raise the sword to me, priest? Malini asked. She did not allow herself to feel fear or even anger. She had faced worse. And if Chandra had given holy men sabers and sent them to war with her, well, what did that matter? They would be either poor at faith and politics or poor at war, and either suited her well enough. I am here to serve the High Prince on Emperor Chandra's behalf, the priest said. I have come, as have my brethren, for the sake of Parijatvipa, because I understand sacrifice. But you do not, Princess Malini. There was a sudden, strange urgency in his voice. Distantly, she heard the low wail of a conch being sounded. One of the commanders had seen something. Another wail. Something was glinting on the walls of the fort. Archers. Warning. Danger. Danger. The priest's voice rose higher as the highborn lords muttered and turned their heads, slow to mark the danger, as soldiers drew their shields. As Malini straightened, tense in her carriage, unwilling to show weakness, forcing herself to trust in the defenses surrounding. Next to her, Razia calmly reached for her own bow, knocking an arrow as if she was contemplating shooting the priest square through the eye. The mothers of flame blessed their sons, he cried out, words tumbling over themselves. When the mothers chose to die by fire, their deaths, their sacrifice, were a blessing, an act that summoned magical flame to the swords of their followers. We have all read the book of the mothers, Mahesh said impatiently. He was gripping his saber hard. Men, restrain the priest. Carefully. If you understand the nature of sacrifice, Princess Malini, the priest said swiftly as soldiers surrounded him, you would do your part, as so many other women have, willingly and gladly, for your emperor brother's sake. Other women, she repeated flatly, as her heart thudded as a sickening jolt of understanding ran through her. He stared back at her. The fervent light of his smile had faded, leaching from his mouth to fill his eyes, which were painfully wide and fixed upon her. The weapons that shall be turned upon you and all the emperor's enemies are carried in their ashes, he announced with pride. They burn to save the world, as the mothers burned. But you can do no less. Know your place, Princess Malini, and see what women braver than you have wrought. He raised a hand. Malini looked up as the gate of the fort opened once more, flung wide to release riders on horseback holding blades that glowed, tendrils of smoke rising around them. Looked up and saw fire begin to rain from the sky. Her army had faced fire arrows before. They were a weapon of war, and the commander of each branch of the army sprawled across the field before her. Horse, cavalry, elephant, foot soldier knew how to respond to such tactics. Even staffs or swords covered in flame could be fought. But this fire was wrong. It bloomed, winged like birds, soaring, jumping from one body to the next, sentient and graceful. As one body fell, it shifted to the next, seeking fuel. Alive. It was alive. The air filled with the smell of smoke, of burning bodies. She could see only the barest glimpse of Mahesh, still upright in his chariot, gripping on tightly as his horse careened forward, trampling through the press of foot soldiers ahead of her. Before her and around her, men ran back and forth without direction. Some of them burning, the air filled with an awful char and screaming. Malini thought of a line from the Book of Mothers. a line that spoke of holy fire, sentient and twisting and writhing. Its many forked tongues, its wings of flame, did turn hands upon the Yaksa, and reduce them to ash, and did not rest until everything lay dead in its path. Malini looked sharply back at the camp. She heard distant cries. Half her army remained behind. Someone in the camp would surely have noticed by now what was happening. They would send more men, and swiftly. She could not allow that. Not against this. They needed to retreat. They needed to think. The chariot jolted. The horse was panicking, rearing up no matter how her charioteer tried to soothe it, his own hands trembling. It jolted again, and once more. Malini was thrown roughly from her feet and against the side of the chariot. She looked at Razia and saw the woman on her knees clutching her own skull. Her hand was bloodied. "Razia!" she yelled in alarm. The woman's head shot up, eyes sharp still. "It's no more than a cut," she said crisply. "Get up." She grasped Razia hard by the arm. "Down," she ordered as loud and as sharp as she could. "We'll be safer on foot." Razia hooked her bow at her back and nodded grimly, grasping Malini in return. The two of them leapt. Overhead, fire shot through the air. A Dwarali woman's horse was struck by it. Malini heard the awful noise of a dying animal, and the crash as another distant chariot overturned. Razia stumbled back, dragged aside by one of her woman's hands, swearing as a soldier ran past her, racing away from the battle in utter panic. And then Malini saw the horse leashed to her chariot fall, and the charioteer slump, an arrow through his throat. She saw her own chariot tip toward her, with all its wood and metal, its great spoked wheels, the sheer weight of it. Razia was out of range. Malini was almost sure. But Malini was not. The chariot was going to crush her to death. Pressure against her body, her feet going out from under her. She had no time to even be afraid, as the soldier shoved her bodily forward, propelling her away from the chariot. She heard a horrible noise, the crunch of bones. She heard his breath punch out of him with the smallest sound, more surprise than agony, and then he went still. His body was beneath the chariot, only his head and one outstretched arm exposed. He was dressed in Parijati white and gold. He was one of her own soldiers. Numbly, even as the sound of screaming and fire filled her ears, she removed his helm. His eyes were open, his mouth parted. The hair bound in a high bun away from his face was knotted. A priest's hair, a priest's face. Another priest, she thought, with a kind of hysterical surprise. By the mothers, had all priests of the mothers taken up armor and blades? Why had one chosen to try and kill her, and another chosen to die for her? "Empress," Razia barked. Her voice was ragged, frayed in a way Malini had never heard before. "Empress Malini, we must move. Come on now." She would. Just not yet. Not yet. She found herself leaning closer to the priest, turning his outstretched arm over. It was partially bare, the sleeve of his tunic ripped. She saw marks on his arm, Sakitan script, blurred ink and skin. A hand gripped her by the shoulder, hauling her up. The guardswoman had surrounded her, and 2 soldiers had joined them, sabers drawn protectively. Their horses were gone. She tried not to think what had become of the poor creatures. Razia looked down at her, face bloodied and pale, her gaze focused upon Malini, so fierce that it forced Malini to focus on her in return. "Empress, we must go," said Razia. "Right now." "Return to the camp, Lady Razia," Malini heard herself saying. She hardly knew her own voice. It was raw, scraped thin, as if she had been screaming. "I must call for a retreat." Why had Mahesh not called for them to do so already? Why were her men still trying to fight? "A conch. I need a conch." "Empress," one of the soldiers choked out, If you fall—" "Empress, what can you do here?" a Dwawali woman demanded. That is the mother's fire." She ignored their voices. With some difficulty she raised her eyes, looking upon the immediate dangers surrounding her. The dying horses, the dead man beside her, the soldiers and guardswomen watching with wide-eyed. The fire leaping from body to body like a thing with mind and hunger and a mortal's cruelty. She watched, with a kind of glassy numbness, as a man was swallowed whole by flame. As he fell to his knees, and then what remained of him fell further still, the fire leaving him as swiftly as it had arrived. Razia was gripping her shoulder, calling her name, louder and louder. "If you will not get me a conch," Malini said deliberately to the people around her, "then I will get one." She would have to move between panicked horses and panicked men in armor, but there in the distance she could see a charioteer with a conch at his hip, frozen at his war chariot, staring at fire as it fell. The commander he must have been carrying was likely long gone, lost in the crush. "Watch for my safety," she said to Razia's guardswoman. She stood, and Razia's grip tightened momentarily before releasing. "Empress," she said, but Malini did not want to be stopped or cajoled. She strode forward, fast, then faster, and then she was running, her hair streaming around her, her saber clanking against her hip, a useless weight. "You heard the Empress," Razia's voice, distant now but steely. "Defend her." She ducked as an arc of flame rippled close enough for her to feel the heat against her cheek, tripped over a wounded man before finding her footing and crossing the ground. One of the High Prince's men was ahead of her, on horseback. Out of the corner of her eye she saw an arrow go into his chest, saw him fall, saw the shadows of one guardswoman and another circle around her. She kept on running. The chariot was ahead of her. Malini, shaking with anger and determination, grasped its edge and dragged herself inside. "Your conch," she demanded, holding her hand out to the charioteer. He fumbled for it and placed it into her hands. "Turn back," she commanded. "Lady Razia needs our assistance, and then we must return to camp." Empress." His lips were almost bloodless, hands trembling. "That was Mother's fire." "Turn back," she said deliberately. "The horse," he managed to say. "It may—" "You have your command. Go." With a crack of his whip the chariot lurched forward, then to the side. Back over the ground she'd run over. Saw Lady Razia with ash upon her cheeks. One of the guardswomen lay dead on the ground in front of her. The chariot juddered, and Malini clutched the conch more tightly, swallowed her own breath. No more careful position in the battle, swaddled by soldiers and cavalry and shields. She was deep in the fray, the wind scouring her face, dust and harsh salt on her lips. "Stop," she commanded the charioteer as he managed to tame his horse long enough to allow Lady Razia to scramble on. "Sahar," Razia said sharply. "Manvi, both of you, come with us." "We'll follow, my lady," Manvi said urgently, frantically urging the chariot forward with her hands, as if she could move its bulk to safety by sheer will alone. Sahar said, "Go, my lady." An arrow embedded itself in the ground to Razia's right. The horse reared. "Steady," Malini called out, as the charioteer held the reins, as if her order had any kind of power to change the course of what was happening around her. Razia went down to her knees, holding the chariot's edge, swearing again, and Malini ground her feet into the base of the chariot and prayed she would not fall. She tilted her head back, brought the conch to her lips. 3 sharp, wailing calls punctured the air. Retreat, retreat, retreat.